أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So carrying on then with the Seerah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Last week we got up to approximately line number 9 in Al-Urjuza Al-Mi'iyya, and that was the section where we covered regarding Halima As-Sa'diyya, his wet nurse, when she took him and looked after him for the first 2 years. And then after the 2 years, she convinced Amina, the mother of the Prophet ﷺ, to allow her to carry on looking after him for longer. And so Amina agreed, and he went back and stayed with Halima As-Sa'diyya a while longer. And it was then that the incident regarding the opening of his chest occurred. When Jibreel alayhi salam came and opened up the chest of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, took out his heart, removed the black spot, cleaned his heart, and then replaced it. Then after that, he returned back to Amina, and when he was 6 years old, she went to Medina to visit her brothers, his uncles, and on the way back, she passed away in a place known as Al-Abwa. So that is approximately where we got up to last time. حليمة لأمه وجاءت به مرضعه سليما حليمة لأمه وعادت به لأهلها كما أرادت فبعد شهرين انشقاق بطنه وقيل بعد 4 من سنه وبعد 6 مع شهر جاء وفاة أمه على الأبواب. So then the next part now. وجده للأبي عبد المطلب بعد 8 مات من غير كذب ثم أبو طالب العم كفت خدمته ثم إلى الشام رحل وذاك بعد عام 12 وكان من أمر بحيرة ما اشتهر. So this section now, it's immediately following on from the death of his mother when he was 6 years old, and that was when they were returning from Medina after having visited his uncles, and so she passed away in a place called Al-Abwa. And we did the narrations about how the Prophet ﷺ visited her grave, and he was not allowed to make dua for her because she died as a non-Muslim. So then the next part in the poem, it mentions about his grandfather, the grandfather of the Prophet ﷺ, Abdul Mutalib. He is the one who then started looking after the Prophet ﷺ after the death of his mother. Abdul Mutalib began looking after him after that. And it's mentioned how Abdul Mutalib used to look after his grandson, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, with a great deal of care. With a great deal of care. And he used to, they mention, he used to allow him to sit on his bed or his area, whereas he never used to let any of his other children sit on that area or on that bed. And so he looked after him with a great deal of care for those 2 years. That is Abdul Muttalib. We know that his grandfather, his name wasn't actually Abdul Mutalib. What was his name actually? the grandfather of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his name was not actually Abdul Mutalib. What was his actual name? Anybody know?
Abdullah ibn Hashim.
Shaybah, or in some they say Shaybatul Hamd. So why was he known as Abdul Muttalib? Why did he become known by this name when his name was actually Shaybah? There's a story that when he was young, when Abdul Mutalib was young, he went with his uncles on a journey once, and when they arrived at their location, Abdul Mutalib was young then in those days, he was with his uncles or elders, and when they got there, the young boy Abdul Mutalib was obviously disheveled from traveling in the deserts. In those days, sand and dirt and everything on his clothes, and when they got there, the people said to the elders, or they thought, that this boy the elders have brought with them is a slave boy. They didn't know that this is one of their relatives, nephews, etc. They thought it was a slave boy that had brought along. So they began saying that you are the Abd of Al-Muttalib. Al-Muttalib, the elder, you are the Abd of Al-Muttalib. You are the servant of Al-Muttalib. But in reality, he was not. He was not a slave boy of him, but that's how he became known as. But his name was actually Shaybah. Shaybatul Hamd, as they say in some. So he looked after the Prophet ﷺ for 2 years. And then he mentions in the poem, وَبَعْدَ ثَمَانٍ مَاتْ مِنْ غَيْرِ كَذِبٍ, that after 8 years, meaning after the Prophet ﷺ got to the age of 8. When the Prophet ﷺ got to the age of 8, then his grandfather passed away. And he says in the poem, مِنْ غَيْرِ كَذِبٍ, without any lie, meaning that is something established and recognized in Seerah among the scholars, that his grandfather died when the Prophet ﷺ was 8 years old. Ibn Ishaq, from the famous historians in Seerah, he said, فَلَمَّا بَلَغَ رَسُولَ اللَّهِ صلى الله عليه وسلم 8 سنين هلك جده عبد المطلب بن هاشم. That when the Prophet ﷺ got to the age of 8, then his grandfather Abdul Mutalib, the son of Hashim, then passed away. So then after he passed away, now the Prophet's father has passed away, the Prophet's mother has passed away, and the Prophet's grandfather has passed away, and the Prophet ﷺ is only 8 years old yet. He's only 8 years old yet. His mother, his father, his grandfather have all passed away. So then, ثم أبو طالب العم كفر. Then it was his uncle Abu Talib who began looking after him. And this is mentioned also in the books of Seerah. Shaykh Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab mentions it in his Mukhtasar al-Seerah, that Abdul Mutalib, before dying, had told Abu Talib, his son Abu Talib, to look after the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. He had told him, make sure you look after him, make sure you take care of him. Abdul Mutalib had told Abu Talib and given him that responsibility to make sure that he looks after him. And Abu Talib is the blood uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. The Prophet's father, Abdullah, was the brother of Abu Talib. The Prophet's father, Abdullah, was the brother of Abu Talib. And so this was his blood uncle. And he looked after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and with a great deal of aid and support. Even though Abu Talib was not a Muslim, and as we'll see later on, he never accepted Islam. But he aided the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with a great amount of aid and support. So much that the Quraysh, the Mushrikun, they used to harm him as well. Not just the Prophet, but him too, even though he was one of them. He was a mushrik like them, he never became a Muslim. Yet they used to harm him as well because of his help and defense and support of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Ibn Ishaq, he mentioned, وَكَانَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمْ بَعْدَ جَدِّهِ عَبْدِ الْمُطَّلِبِ مَعَ عَمِّهِ أَبِي طَالِبٍ. That the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, after his grandfather Abdul Mutalib, was with his uncle Abu Talib, لِوَصِيَّةِ عَبْدِ الْمُطَّلِبِ لَهُ بِهِ, because Abdul Mutalib had told Abu Talib, had given him that responsibility to look after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because Abu Talib was the blood brother of Abdullah, the father of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Both of them, their mother was called Fatima, the daughter of Amr. قال فكان أبو طالب هو الذي يلي أمر رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. So Abu Talib, he was the one who took care of the affairs of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, took care of and held that responsibility regarding the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So that was when the messenger was 8 years old. Abu Talib began looking after him. Then there's a famous story when the Prophet ﷺ got to the age of 12. In fact, before we get to the age of 12, some scholars they said that at the age of 10, what happened again? That his chest was opened again. That is mentioned by some of the scholars. That at the age of 10, another incident occurred where his chest was opened. But then at the age of 12 is a famous incident. When he got to 12 years old, there is a famous incident that occurred, and it's mentioned in the poem, ثُمَّ إِلَى الشَّامِ رَحَلْ. That the Prophet ﷺ, he then went to Sham on a trip. وَذَاكَ بَعْدَ عَامِ 12. And that was after he was 12 years old. وَكَانَ مِنْ أَمْرِ بَحِيرَةَ مَشْتَهَرٍ. And then the story of Bahira is as famous and well known. So when he was 12 years old, his uncle Abu Talib and some of the other tribesmen of the Quraysh, they all went on a trip to Sham. Sham, Palestine, Syria, Iraq, that kind of area, Sham. They went up there on some trip, some business trip or some other kind of trip that they needed to make up to that area. So they went, Abu Talib and some of the other elders of Quraysh, they all went. And the Prophet was only 12, but Abu Talib took him. The scholars, they say, why would Abu Talib take the Prophet with him on this journey? They were going there for some business or other important affair. The elder people, Abu Talib and the other men of the Quraysh, why would they take a boy 12 years old with them? The scholars, they say, because Abu Talib, he had been given that responsibility by Abdul Mutalib to look after the Prophet ﷺ, and he disliked to leave the Prophet behind in Mecca by himself with the other family members, but not under his watch. He's going now, and the Prophet is going to be under somebody else's watch, and he disliked that. He disliked leaving the Prophet under anybody else's watch. If he went traveling to Sham, that would be weeks and weeks until they went and came back. And he disliked leaving the messenger alone or under anybody else's watch for that time, for that period of time. So he preferred to keep him with him. Keep him together with him so he can keep his eye on him, and the Prophet stays under his watch. So he took him on this journey despite how difficult those journeys were in those days across the deserts with the camels and the donkeys and other things traveling. He preferred to take him rather than let him go out of his watch. So that's why they say Abu Talib took him along in that journey. Whereas previously, in the past, they used to go. This was a regular journey they used to make. This was a regular journey up to the Sham area for business or whatever other reasons. It was a regular kind of trip they used to make. But now on this occasion, when Abu Talib went, on this occasion he didn't want to go with just the men, which is what they would have typically done. They wouldn't have taken youngsters with them. But Abu Talib took the Prophet because he didn't want the Prophet to go outside of his watch. So they took the Prophet with them, and the Prophet was 12 years old at that time. Ibn Kathir mentioned, وخرج به عمه إلى الشام في تجارة وهو ابن 12 سنة. Ibn Kathir, he mentioned in Al-Fusul, the book in Seerah, he said the uncle of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam went out on the journey to Sham for business. It was for business, and he took the messenger with him. The messenger went out with his uncle to the business trip to Sham, and he was only 12 years old at the time. وَذَلِكَ مِنْ تَمَامِ لُطْفِهِ بِهِ, and that was due to Abu Talib's great compassion towards the messenger. لِعَدَمِ مَنْ يَقُومُ بِهِ إِذَا تَرَكَهُ بِمَكَّةِ, because there was no other adult who could really fulfill that responsibility and keep the Prophet Muhammad under their watch and look after him. There was nobody else who could really do that. فرأى هو وأصحابه ممن خرج معه إلى الشام من الآيات فيه صلى الله عليه وسلم ما زاد عمه في الوصاة به والحرص عليه. It's mentioned on that journey, they saw things in Muhammad. They saw things in him that, convinced them even further, or convinced them that he is someone special. They saw things from him that occurred, which led to Abu Talib becoming even stronger in his mindset of making sure no harm comes to the Prophet Muhammad. And of course we are saying the Prophet Muhammad, but he was 12 at this time and they did not know he is a prophet or anybody knew he was a prophet. So now then, there is a famous story of what happened when they went on this journey. 12 years old with his uncle and some of the other tribesmen of Quraysh, they went on this journey to Sham, a typical journey they used to make quite often. And there was something strange that happened on this occasion. Shaykh Al-Albani mentions it in his book of Seerah, Sahih As-Seerah Al-Nabawiyya, the authentic Seerah Al-Nabawiyya from the other sections. He says that روى الحافظ أبو بكر الخرائطي من طريق يونس ابن أبي إسحاق عن أبي بكر ابن أبي موسى عن أبيه قال. So he mentions the narration. There's a narration about what happened when they went out on that journey. In the narration it says, خرج أبو طالب إلى الشام ومعه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم في أشياخ من قريش, that Abu Talib went to Sham along with other elders from Quraysh, and with them was the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فَلَمَّا أَشْرَفُوا عَلَى الرَّاهِبِ. So when they went on their journey and they were getting close to their destination where they were going to do their business, as they approached, they came past a monk. Their route that they used to take always went past this house or this area where this monk lived. They always used to go past him. That was the road. So when they arrived at that part where the monk lives, and his name was Bahira, some of them say Buhaira, and some of them even dispute if that was even his name. That is disputed over whether his name was even that, but most of the narrations they say that. Bahira, or maybe pronounced as Buhaira. So when they were going past that area where they always used to go past and the monk was always there, when they were going past on this occasion, maybe it was some kind of small village en route. When they stopped at that area, they put down their things and they set up camp, as we say. And this was a normal thing. This was their normal route. They set up their camp. فَخَرَجَ إِلَيْهِمُ الرَّاهِبُ. So now the monk, who typically used to see them going by, setting up camp, going again, never used to come out to them to speak to them or anything. They'd gone by many times in the past. This monk had never come out. But on this occasion, the monk came out to them. This whole caravan, 20, 30, 40 of them, however many of them there were, they had pitched up there now, and this time the monk came out to them. He would never usually come out to them. In fact, there's a difference of opinion as to whether it was actually a monk or a rabbi. There are some scholars who say it was a rabbi in the story. But others, they say no, it was a monk. The monk is from the Christians, the rabbi is from the Jews. What is definite is that he was from the people of the book. Most of them say a monk. It was a monk. So on this occasion, this monk came out to them. Whereas normally they would pass by many times before. He never bothered to come out to them. This time he came out to them. وَكَانُوا قَبْلَ, it says, وَكَانُوا قَبْلَ ذَلِكَ يَمُرُّونَ بِهِ فَلَا يَخْرُجُ وَلَا يَلْتَفِتُ إِلَيْهِ. In the past, it says it in the narration, in the past, they used to pass by him and he never used to come out. He never even used to bother even looking at them or anything. It was just a normal thing. Travelers coming by, pitching up for the night, whatever, and then continuing. Never even used to bother with them. It was no issue. But on this occasion, he made the effort to come out to them. فَنَزَلَ وَهُمْ يُحِلُّونَ رِحَالَهُمْ. So he came out to them as they were, as we say, they were pitching up. They were pitching up their tents or whatever it was. They were setting up as he came out to them. فَجَعَلَ, and remember, they were a big group. They were a big group, maybe 20, 30, 40, 50, who knows, a big group of them. So they were all setting up. فَجَعَلَ يَتَخَلَّلُهُمْ. So the monk came and started walking in and around them. This big group of people all setting up their things now. The monk started walking in and around this group of people. حَتَّى جَاءَ فَأَخَذَ بِيَدِ النَّبِيِّ صلى الله عليه وسلم. Until the monk came and found the Prophet Muhammad in this group. He found him, he came and took him by the hand. The monk came and took him by the hand. فَقَالَ, and he said, and obviously Abdul Mutalib and the other Quraysh people were there. The monk says, هَذَا سَيِّدُ الْعَالَمِينَ. This is the leader of mankind. To Muhammad, who is 12 years old right now. This is the leader of mankind. And in one version, هَذَا رَسُولُ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. This is the messenger of the Lord of everything in creation. And in one version, يَبْعَثُهُ اللَّهُ رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ. Allah is sending him, or going to send him, as a mercy to all of mankind. So now all the elders, Abu Talib and everybody is looking at this. The monk coming out to them, which was unusual anyway, the monk never used to bother coming out to them. He comes out, he comes to the boy Muhammad, takes him by the hand and says to them, he is the leader of mankind. He is the messenger sent by Allah. All the men, Abdul Mutalib and the others, they are looking at this and then they say to the monk, فَقَالَ لَهُ أَشْيَاخ مِنْ قُرَيْشٍ. The elders of Quraysh were there, said to him, وَمَا عَلَّمَكَ. And how do you know that? What has educated you? What has or how have you come to know this? Basically they were asking him, what are you talking about? How do you know this? فَقَالَ. So then the monk said to them, إِنَّكُمْ حِينَ أَشْرَفْتُمْ مِنَ الْعَقَبَةِ لم يبق شجر ولا حجر إلا خر ساجدا ولا يسجدون إلا لنبي. He said to them, when you people were coming, so this was some kind of small village or wherever they were, in the distance there were some mountains and there was a kind of mountain pass. He said, as you were all coming down in the distance, we saw you all approaching on the road that comes through here, goes all the way from there. We saw you approaching. As we saw you approaching, the trees, there was not a single tree or a stone except that it bowed to you. There was not a single tree or stone or except that it fell in prostration to you. And they, the monk said, they do not prostrate except if it's a prophet coming through. All the trees and stones they prostrated, and they do not prostrate except if it is a prophet coming through. That was the first reason he told them, I know. The second reason he said to them, وَإِنِّي أَعْرِفُهُ بِخَاتَمِ النُّبُوَّةِ أَسْفَلَ مِنْ غُضْرُوفِ كَتِفِهِ. He said, I also know him because of the seal of prophethood on his shoulder. Because of the seal of prophethood on his shoulder. We'll come to that in a minute. ثم رجع فصنع لهم طعاما. Then the monk went and made some food for them. فلما أتاهم, and then when he brought the food out to them, وكان هو في رعية الإبل فقال, and the people, this big camp of them, they had camels and other things, and it was all busy what was going on. When he came out with the food, he said, go send for Muhammad. Where is he? Where is he? Go bring him. So the Prophet Muhammad, wherever he was in the camp over there, he started coming. فأقبل وغمامة تظله. As the messenger was coming, it says in the narration, there was a cloud. This was during the daytime this happened. There was a cloud on top of him, staying with him. As he walked, the cloud kept coming with him, shading him from the sun. The cloud kept coming with him as the messenger walked and approached them. فَلَمَّا دَنَا مِنَ الْقَوْمِ. So when the messenger got close to where they were all congregating, the monk said, انظروا إليه عليه غمامة. The monk said, look at him. He has the cloud coming with him, the cloud covering him. فَلَمَّا دَنَا مِنَ الْقَوْمِ. So when the messenger got to where they were all sitting, وَجَدَهُمْ قَدْ سَبَقُوهُ إِلَى فَيْءِ الشَّجَرَةِ. They were all sitting under a tree. This was in the daytime, all of this happened. Sun was coming down hot. They were all sitting under a tree. And in particular, on one side of a tree where there was the shade, because the sun was at the angle, so the shade of the tree was on the other angle. They were sitting on the side where all the shade of the tree was. The messenger, when he got there, the shade was full. They were all sitting in the shaded area. There was no space on the shaded area. So imagine a tree, the sun is coming, there's all the tree shade on one side, they're all filling that shaded area. So when the messenger came, he had to sit just on the other side there, next to them in an unshaded area. But it mentions in the hadith, فَلَمَّا جَلَسَ, when he sat down, مَالَ فَيْءُ الشَّجَرَةِ عَلَيْهِ, the angle of the shadow changed and went to the side he was, and now he was under shade. So then the monk said, انظروا, look, إلى فَيْءِ الشَّجَرَةِ, look at the shade of the tree, مَالَ عَلَيْهِ, look at how it changed across to his angle where he is to cover him. Look at how that happened. The monk is telling them to prove further what he said to them. He is the leader of mankind. He is the messenger who was sent. He said, look at how the shadow changed. قال فبينما هو قائم عليهم وهو ينشدهم ألا يذهبوا به إلى الروم. So as he was there, he was telling them, because he was convinced now, he knew this is the prophet. He knew, the monk knew. He was telling them, don't take him where you're going, towards the Sham area, towards up that side where Romans were and others, and the Christians, etc. Don't go over there. Don't take him up there. He was telling them, don't go, don't go. فَإِنَّ الرُّومَ إِنْ رَأَوْهُ عَرَفُوهُ بِالصِّفَةِ فَقَتَلُوا. Because if they, over there, the Romans, they see him and they recognize him by his characteristics, just like the monk did, they'll kill him. So the monk was trying to convince them, just turn around, go back, send him back. Don't carry on with him over there. Because the people of the book were over there, Jews and Christians. And if they recognized him, they would kill him. That's what he was telling them. Don't go. So as he was trying to convince them, don't go, don't go. فَإِذَا هُوَ بِسَبَعَةِ نَفَرٍ مِنَ الرُّومِ قَدْ أَقْبَلُوا. And all of a sudden, a group of 7 of the Romans approached. Just suddenly 7 of them approached, coming from the distance. So the monk went to go speak to them. He went to go and speak to them before they got to the camp. فَاسْتَقْبَلَهُمْ فَقَالَ مَا جَاءَ بِكُمْ. The monk said to them, so why is it that you come here? How come you are coming here? قالوا جئنا أن هذا النبي خارج في هذا الشهر. They said, we've come because we have come to know that the messenger is coming out this month. We have come to know that the messenger is coming out this month. فَلَمْ يَبْقَ طَرِيقٌ إِلَّا بُعِثَ إِلَيْهِ النَّاسِ. So there is not any pathway left except that we have sent people to go get it. وَإِنَّا أُخْبِرْنَا خَبَرُهُ إِلَى طَرِيقِ كَهَذِهِ. And we have been informed that this is where he is approaching from, this pathway. So the monk said to them, فَهَلْ خَلْفَكُمْ أَحَدٌ هُوَ خَيْرٌ مِّنْكُمْ. Is there anybody else coming from after you who is better than you? قالوا لا. They said no. قالوا لا إنما أخبرنا خبره إلى طريق كهذه. They said, we've been told he is coming here on this path. قال أفرأيتم أمرا أراد الله أن يقضيه أن يستطيع أحد من الناس رده. He said to them, if Allah decrees something, can anybody stop that? فقالوا لا. They said no. قال فبايعوه وأقاموا معه عنده. قال. So then the monk said to them that you should take the pledge of allegiance. But in any case, it mentions in the story that eventually the monk managed to convince them that there's nobody here, there's no prophet here, go search elsewhere. He managed to push them away. And that group then went and they didn't find the messenger and take him. So those individuals went. Now the threat was real. It was known that they were after him and they were looking for him. So then the monk came back and said to them, he said, فَقَالَ الرَّاهِبُ أَنْشَدَكُمُ اللَّهُ أَيُّكُمْ وَلِيُّهُ. قَالُوا أَبُو طَالِبٍ. The monk came back and he said, look, which one of you is the guardian of Muhammad? Which one of you is the guardian of Muhammad? They said, Abu Talib. Abu Talib is the guardian. فَلَمْ يَزَلْ يُنَاشِدُهُ حَتَّى رَدَّهُ. So the monk kept talking to Abu Talib, kept talking to him to convince him, send him back, send Muhammad back. They will get him, they are looking for him, they will kill him, send him back. Kept talking to Abu Talib until eventually Abu Talib agreed to let Muhammad go back and not carry on with them on the journey. And it's mentioned in this narration, بَعَثَ مَعَهُ أَبُو بَكْرَ وَبِلَالَ. That Abu Talib didn't just send Prophet Muhammad to walk back by himself and go back by himself. Obviously some of the people were going to go with him. And he also sent back with him Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. In this narration it says he was on the trip. And Bilal, the Mu'adhin, that he was on this trip. And Abu Talib sent them two back as well. Abu Bakr and Bilal back with the Prophet Muhammad to go back. وَزَوَّدَهُ الرَّاهِبُ مِنَ الْكَعْكِ وَالزَّيْتِ. And it mentions how the monk gave some food for that small return party to travel back. That is the narration that is mentioned in At-Tirmidhi and the Mustadrak of Al-Hakim, Al-Bayhaqi, Ibn Asakir and others. However, there is a lot of dispute over the authenticity of this narration. There is a lot of dispute, a big difference of opinion about the authenticity of this narration for multiple reasons. One of them is the actual narrator, Abu al-Ash'ari. He's the narrator. Yet he didn't meet the Prophet ﷺ up until the year 7 Hijri. This incident was occurring, so this was 12, the messenger was 12. The Hijrah occurred when he was approximately 53, call it 52, 53, 40 years. So this is minus 40 Hijrah. This incident occurred in minus 40 Hijrah on the calendar. Minus 40 Hijrah. That's right, yes. And Abu Musa al-Ash'ari didn't meet the messenger until 7 Hijri. So there's a gap of 57 years before Abu Musa al-Ash'ari actually met the messenger to when the story happened. They said, how was he narrating the story? How is he narrating this story? He didn't meet the messenger for another 57 years. For another decades later, he met the Prophet ﷺ. How is he narrating this story? So that is one of the first issues many of the scholars have. They say this narration can't be right. How can the narrator have narrated this narration? He didn't meet the messenger until 7th Hijri. That's one issue they mention. Another issue they mention from the story itself, at the beginning when the monk says to them, as you were approaching the trees and the rocks, prostrated. They said, no, that's unusual. Trees and rocks, they do not prostrate to the Prophet ﷺ. Prostration is only to Allah. Even the trees and the rocks, they don't prostrate to the Prophet ﷺ. So they say that's an issue. That part in the story, that doesn't seem to add up, that the trees were prostrating down to the Prophet ﷺ, the rocks were prostrating down. That is another issue they bring up when they say the story can't be right. But other scholars, they say that part isn't that big a deal. Perhaps it just indicates that the trees were lowering slightly as the messenger went by, and the rocks were perhaps just lowering slightly as he went by, not actually prostrating. So that could possibly pass. But that is another issue they mention. You see, how were the trees and stones prostrating to the messenger? Another issue they mention, the cloud. They say the part about the cloud that was sitting on top of the Prophet ﷺ. And as he approached them, the cloud was sitting on top of him and keeping him shaded. They say if that's the case, Then when he got to the tree where everybody else was sitting down and taking shade, and the shaded area, that angle of the tree was all full with the people, and he had to sit on the other side where there was no shade. But how can that possibly be accurate? If the messenger came along with a cloud on top of him full of shade, when he got to the tree and that cloud was on top of him, there would be no shade left on the tree anywhere, because now the cloud is covering the sun. He's coming with the cloud on top of him. So when he gets to the tree and the cloud is on top of him, it's covering the sun, there wouldn't be any shade left on any side of the tree. How was there still shade on one side, and when he sat down it was on a side where there was no shade? When he had the cloud on top of him as well, there would have been shade everywhere, there would have been no sun. So they say that doesn't seem to add up. How did he have a cloud and yet there was shade and there was no shade, and then the shade moved and yet there's a cloud on top of him? How does all that work, they say? That doesn't seem to add up, they say. So that is another part of the story, they say, doesn't seem to add up. The issue of the shade and the cloud. Those are some of the main issues they have. The issue of the cloud, the issue of the trees and the stones prostrating, the issue of the narrator. They say this narrator, it cannot be. He did not meet the messenger till years and years later. Oh, and another issue. They say, how was Abu Bakr on this trip? How was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq on this trip? Yes, he was there and he was from the people of Makkah, etc. But Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, remember before we said they never used to take youngsters really. And they only took Prophet Muhammad because Abdul Mutalib wanted to keep him under his watch. And he was 12. Abu Bakr would have been how old at that time? 10, because Abu Bakr was 2 years younger than the Prophet, or 2.5 years younger than the Prophet ﷺ. Why would they take a 10-year-old or a 9.5-year-old? Why would they have taken Abu Bakr as-Siddiq on this trip? The scholars, they say that seems to make no sense, because in the narration it says at the end, when the monk convinced Abu Talib sent the Prophet back, along with Abu Bakr, told him to go back and Bilal. They say, how was Abu Bakr there? He would have been 9, 10 years old at that time. What was he doing on that trip? They say it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense that Abu Bakr would have been there on the trip. But what doesn't make even more sense is what? Yeah. Bilal. How could Bilal have been on this trip? Abu Bakr as-Siddiq bought Bilal as a slave years later. And in the biography of Bilal, for his age, he wouldn't have even been born yet. For his age compared to Abu Bakr and the Prophet, ﷺ, he wasn't even born yet. And even if he was, he definitely wasn't on that trip with them. Abu Bakr purchased him years later. You see how? How can that be? Abu Bakr and Bilal on this trip. So they have multiple reasons to doubt the authenticity of this narration. But in a nutshell, when you look at it all and you examine it, and the scholars of hadith, they've looked at it all and they've examined it, they say the story in its basis is true. That this incident happened. They went on that journey when the messenger was 12, and they did bump into that monk. The monk did tell them about this, about the Prophet, he's going to be the Prophet, and the seal of the prophethood. That basic story happened. As for the details, the cloud, the shade, Abu Bakr and Bilal being there, those kinds of details, they say, okay, those details maybe not. But the actual foundation of the story, that did this incident happen when they went and they met the monk? Yes. That incident happened, but the details of the story, maybe some parts are legitimate and authentic, and maybe some parts are not. So that is basically what they say about it. One thing we want to mention as well is about the seal of the prophethood. Because one of the things the monk said to them was, and when they said, how do you know? What are you talking about? one of the points of evidence he had was, he said the seal of the prophethood is on the messenger. The seal of the prophethood is what? What was the seal of the prophethood? Like a birthmark?
Khatim Nabi. Straight on his back. Khatim Nabi, the last prophet. Khatim Nabi.
Okay. So the Prophet ﷺ had some kind of mark to the left side, not down the middle of his back, exactly towards the left side. On his shoulder blade at the back, on the shoulder, he had a mark. The first thing to note is this was not an external mark. It's not like when you get it's not like cauterization. When you get the hot steel thing and it's boiling red hot and you do it on the person. It wasn't one of those. It's not anything external. There wasn't any external mark that was branded onto him. Not like that. It was something like you might want to say biological. It was something from his own body. Not something external branded on or stuck on or imprinted on. It was something from his own body. And some people may describe it as a kind of birthmark. It was the size of an egg. It says in narrations, multiple narrations, the size of an egg. A birthmark the size of an egg at the back of his shoulder on the left-hand side. Could be described as a birthmark. Could be described as an area where the skin is popping out somewhat, it's coming out, it's protruding, where there's some muscle under there. There is some kind of muscle under there, it's protruding out. Sometimes when a person maybe gets injured, and then you're left with a kind of scar almost, where your skin then heals up over it. Maybe that kind of thing, where it looks like how a person might injure themselves and then the skin heals over, and then you have a little bump still left there, and there's muscle underneath, and you can see the difference in the skin coming out. There was a type of mark of some nature like that on the back of his body, where the skin was coming out, the size of an egg amount, where it was his skin and his muscle from his body, not some external kind of mark. Also, all of the narrations that say that this mark had anything written on it, like Muhammad Rasulullah, those narrations, all of them are weak. There was nothing written on it. There was nothing written on it. It was more like a birthmark or some type of skin and muscle just coming out from the back, a type of mark on the back of his body. But nothing written on it. Not Muhammad Rasulullah. There are narrations that say that. There are some narrations that say it, but they are weak. And the scholars, they say, probably the narrator who narrated those narrations just got it mixed up between that khatam and the ring that the Prophet used to wear, khatam. On the ring it used to say, Muhammad Rasulullah, Allah Rasul Muhammad. On the ring it used to say that, but not on this khatam. So they say maybe the narrator just mixed it up between this seal and the ring. The same word. So not on this. There was nothing written on that. It was just some type of mark, like a birthmark. Some of them say it was like a reddish color. That's more towards like if you injure yourself and then it heals over and it's red or pinky kind of skin color, but you can see it's different. It's like a scar. Some say it was that kind of color. There are some narrations saying it was a darker kind of color, but there was this kind of skin and muscle that was protruding out somewhat, the size of an egg on the back, and that was known as the seal of the prophethood. There are many narrations about that, about the companions talking about that and mentioning it. I forgot the narrations now. There's a narration of where one time a young child, and I forgot who now, a young child once came with one of the companions, and either the messenger was holding her or the father was holding her, and she was touching this. It says in the narration, she was touching this as a child. You see something unusual, and she was touching it, and the father then told her, stop it. And so it mentions narrations, many of them like this, about this item or this seal, this kind of mark on the back of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. That is where we'll have to stop today then. We'll carry on next week from this section. And the first thing, remind me next week, the first thing we have to do is talk about more detail on how this monk Bahira was able to recognize Muhammad. Muhammad was only 12 years old at the time, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. How did he manage to recognize him instantly, that this is him, he's the messenger? It needs more than just some of these details. There must be something more. Remind me, we have to begin with that detail next week about how he managed to recognize him straight away. So that's what we'll stop on today. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.